Welcome to the White Knuckle Podcast with your hosts, Jason Science and Dr. Clint McCoy.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 120 of the White Knuckle Podcast. I've got in studio with me Mr. Travis Homley to my right. On the other end of the line, across quite a ways across the country on the East Coast, is Mr. Bronson Strickland and Mr. Steve Demarais. Bronson and Steve are co-directors of MSU's Deer Lab. How's it going?
Well, hey, everybody. This is Bronson. All is going well down here in Mississippi. We actually have some Midwest weather coming our way, and really looking forward to that. We're actually going to get some freezing temperatures. And
congratulations, welcome to the club.
Yeah. And believe it or not, we in certain parts of the state we are approaching the peak of the rut. So this person right here speaking is going to be pursuing some deer in the next few days.
Sweet.
And the other person, this is Steve Demarais. I'm not going to be pursuing any deer this weekend, but we're always thinking about deer. Bronson and I have grown up as hunters, and we both worked in undergrad, graduate school. We both have masters and PhDs working on deer biology and putting that biology in the context of management. So we do deer 365.
You know, I've got Travis Homley sitting next to me, and he's filling in for Clint McCoy, who's hard to fill in for. But
big shoes to fill.
Right, big shoes to fill, exactly. If you guys would, just tell Travis a little bit about, just for a little bit of background, and then whatever listeners who haven't heard of you guys, which I'd find it hard to believe very few of them haven't, but just let us really quick give us an idea of your backgrounds and what it is that you do for MSU, and then we'll jump into today's topic.
You want to start, Steve?
All right. Yeah, I want to make sure, too, we hear a lot of MSU, and if you Google MSU, you might get Michigan State University, and they're a great wildlife program also, but I want people to know that we're Mississippi State University. We're the MSU South, they're the MSU North. And we have a Department of Wildlife and Fisheries here, and like I said earlier, Bronson and I both grew up hunting and fishing, and I wanted to be a wildlife biologist from when I was in high school, and which I grew up in Massachusetts, did my deer hunting in Maine and Vermont, because back then there were no deer to speak of in Massachusetts. And I came to Mississippi for grad school, finished that up, went to Texas and worked as a big game specialist mostly at Texas Tech University, the Red Raiders, and then came back here to Mississippi State in 1997, and I've been loving it as the big game specialist, the deer specialist for Mississippi State ever since then.
Yeah, and this is Bronson. My background or path is similar. I'm really, really lucky, like Steve, in that I never had a problem figuring out what I wanted to do career-wise for the rest of my life. So I got an undergraduate degree. I was born and raised in Georgia. So I got an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology at the University of Georgia. Was able then to move to South Texas and continue some research there, working on some really big ranches and studying deer carrying capacity and how that changes with the environment and so forth. And after that, I moved to Mississippi to actually work for Steve at the time. And that is where I got my PhD. And then a few years after that, again, very, very lucky, a position opened up here within the department that overlaps and works well with Steve. And my focus is mainly outreach. So Steve and I kind of team up, and, we have the MSU Deer Lab. And, Steve's focus is on the research part of it. And he helps me with the outreach, and my focus is on the outreach part of it, and I assist Steve with research. So we're kind of a team down here. And gosh, I've been about 15 years with you and I together in this role with the MSU Deer Lab. So, we're having a great time, and thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, you guys definitely have immersed yourself in the deer world here recently, and you've got a project that, in layman's terms, studies buck travel. Correct?
Yeah, buck movement. Jason, this project kind of germinated from the State Wildlife Agency. Every year at the end of hunting season, during hunting season, they hear from hunters, we're not seeing the deer. We've shot too many. We need to do something different. You need to fix the problem. And as biologists, we would say, well, the weather's been too warm. You're kind of being a lazy hunter. You don't go and sit in the same box stand, 3 nights or 3 days out of the week and month after month and expect to see deer. Just being lazy. And they get tired of hearing that. And so the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks here funded this project using our federal aid funding mechanism, which is, when hunters buy a license, a rifle or ammunition, there's a federal excise tax, and that goes to the federal government, and then they apportion it to the different states to do wildlife research and wildlife restoration work. And so they gave us some money, and they said, tell us what bucks do in response to hunting pressure. And so, we had to kind of come up with a catchy name for this whole effort. We're trying to determine if adult bucks, are they smart or just lucky? Because that's the class of animals that most hunters don't see very often. Or, when I grew up hunting in New England, I never saw anything but a spike buck, a yearling buck, all my hunting years in New England.
So you would say...
So we started out, with this goal to work with the state agency, and we had to find a place in the state that had a lot of adult bucks. And there was an area along what's called the Big Black River here in kind of central Mississippi, and there was a lot of it's all private land ownership,
Mm-hmm.
and mostly larger land holdings, anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 acres. And it had been in a quality deer management and greater, being all the way up to trophy deer management for probably 20 years. And so they had a good adult deer sex ratio that pretty much, maybe a doe and a half to every buck or 2 does to every buck across 60,000 acres. So it was a great place to work, and we convinced landowners to let us go on the property and capture their adult bucks and basically make them off limits to harvest for a 3-year period, which was, if you go and try to tell a hunter, don't shoot that 150 class buck just because he has a collar, that's asking a lot. But we did, and they came through for us.
Wow.
A couple of hunters shoot deer by mistake, but mostly they were good.
How many? Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I like to relate the buck capture process to bow hunting, archery hunting. We were in stands, and we had to get the bucks within 20 to 25 yards of our stand and dart them with we were using a dart rifle, but it's a pretty heavy dart that we're shooting. It's not like a high-powered rifle projectile that can reach out a couple 100,000 yards, but a couple 100 yards accurately. We were 20 to 30 yards max. And so we're literally bow hunting to capture these deer. And we had a research permit, so we were allowed to use bait, and we sat into the night with night vision goggles and infrared and night vision. And most all of the bucks that we collared, we have data from 68 bucks at least 1 year. And so we call it a lot of adult bucks, anywhere from, most of them are 3 to 6 years of age. But I can't think of a single one, Jason and Travis, that we caught during the daytime. It was at least 95 to 99% of them were at night. And I'm not promoting night hunting. I'm just saying that so that your listeners can understand. If you're trying to get within 20 yards of an adult buck, it's hard to do during the daytime.
So let me that sort of begs the question, if I can just maybe go down one rabbit hole real quick. Do you think that would have been different if you were collaring or hunting for, if you will, any buck? In other words, younger bucks?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yearling bucks, they're not really educated.
Not the brightest animal in the woods.
Yeah.
Right.
They're used to following mama, and then they get kicked out of the family unit, and they're just kind of learning their ways, and they don't know how to avoid. And that's one of the previous research has looked at yearlings and 2-year-olds and shown that they get smarter with age. So we wanted to look at adult bucks and that have already been educated, and how do they respond to hunting pressure?
Sure. Interesting. So roughly 66,000 private acres, right?
Yeah, over 60,000. And if we covered all the area that the bucks moved to, we had one buck that moved 13 miles away. So, we had a 60 or so thousand acre core research area that was pretty much all the landowners in that area agreed to us trapping deer and not harvesting deer. But some of those bucks moved, as far away as 13 miles. So that doesn't include all that acreage in between.
So, you referenced bucks, and Clint always uses the term homers or roamers, and it sounds like just like people, every buck is different. So I'm assuming they have different personalities, and those personalities dictate their movement.
Absolutely. If Clint was here, I'd say that's brilliant, Clint. You can choose to.
We're gonna have to edit that part out.
Yeah. But we actually looked at the movement characteristics of our adult bucks, and we came up with 2 different personalities. And I like the homer and roamer. It actually sounds much more elegant than my mobile bucks and sedentary bucks. But we found that about a third of our adult bucks lived actually in 2 home ranges. At least 2 home ranges, and these home ranges could be separated by a couple of miles. Most of them were in the 3 to 5 mile range, and then the one buck moved 13 miles, and then he came back. So he has 2 home ranges separated by 13 miles. So I guess these bucks, this 1/3 of the adult bucks we had, would fall into the mobile or roamer class. And this is the kind of buck that there's so many hunters that have these stories. Well, I hunted this property, for 2 months, and then this buck just showed up. I never had him on my trail camera. He just showed up. And, I've had people tell me, I've had the same buck show up in October each of the last 2 or 3 years. And he shows up and hangs around for a month, and I only get him at night, and then he's gone, and I don't get him until the next year. And so, these buck behaviors, hunters, like your listeners, probably have all kinds of anecdotal stories about these kind of deer, but we had a sample of 68 of them, so we could really document with these transmitting collars. Like I said, a third of them were living in 2 home ranges, and then that leaves the other 2/3 that we're calling sedentary. And even a sedentary buck is still fairly mobile, and he's moving within his home range. It's a single home range, but he's still making excursions of 1 or 2 miles up to 3 miles out of his normal home range. And these excursions are more, short term, like 1 to 5 or 7 days. Makes a roundabout and then comes back in. These mobile bucks, they're going and staying months at a time. So there's these two different personalities. The sedentary bucks, they have one home range, but they're still not just in that home range. They can be moving a couple of miles for short distance, short time periods.
Question, this is Travis. With that, did you see any kind of relationship with when they were in velvet versus hard-horned in those different home territories?
That's a great question, Travis, and the answer is that's still under analysis. We're working this semester analyzing when they move and quantifying just how far they are moving and coming up with a more specific analysis like that. So maybe in the future we come back on and give more details about that.
You always hear the stories of somebody kills a booner or a 200-inch deer, and nobody talks about that deer until somebody harvests that deer. And then once everybody gets together and starts talking about that and getting pictures together, people lost that deer at different times of the year, and they always hunted around the time that that deer was on their farm. And it kind of put, what you guys are saying, that up to 2 miles these deer are moving, but you really don't know about it until you put the whole puzzle together. And it's a huge thing that we all try to, look at and, hold the deer on our farm, but realistically, they got a mind of their own.
Absolutely.
So with respect to personalities and daily movements and things of that nature, what differences did you see? And was there, I think that we can say that in deer and deer hunting, there's the only absolute is there's no absolute. And would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick and then get off and let Bronson talk, because I've been monopolizing things. But I like to say never and never say always when it comes to whitetail deer.
Probably good advice.
What's interesting, I think, Steve, what you said is with the personalities is we've always heard stories, even us as researchers, of these really exceptional bucks in terms of they picked up and moved away, and until research like this, where we can literally put a GPS collar on them and follow all of these deer, I think we had always assumed that was an anomaly, an outlier, something special happened to that buck to cause that behavior. But I think what we've shown here pretty definitively that when it's a third of them, this is a pretty set personality type or a set behavior, probably going to see everywhere.
Yeah, and in fact, the extreme case, that buck that moved 13 miles between his two home ranges, we caught that deer during August, and then within 2 days after we collared him, he moved 13 miles. We thought, oh, dang, we scared him or pissed him off or something. But we didn't realize at the time that he was going to spend several months over there, and then he came back and was back where he was captured. And the following August, guess what he did again?
Same thing.
He left. So we were just lucky to catch him right before he made his 13-mile movement, or we never would have caught that extreme movement example.
So would it be fair to say that on the average, if you have 5 years of intel on one buck, and he typically leaves October 1st, that he's probably going to leave October 1st-ish again? Is that what your research would have concluded?
that specific example almost to the day, my 13-mile buck example, we're quantifying when they moved so that we can come up with those statistics for you in the future.
Okay. Interesting. There has to be so many moving parts to this study, and it sounds like a big undertaking. So
Say the least, yeah.
yeah, I bet. So you've got all these different 60-ish bucks, 50, 60, 70 bucks that you're tracking, and they all have a different personality. Was there anything that was pretty uniform throughout the group, like in terms of maybe bedding or feeding? Like, did they all have different preferences for bedding, or by and large, did they all bed in a certain type of area? Or was there a characteristic of that area that stood out more than other areas?
I don't think we dug that deep, Steve, unless you remember something. I don't think we looked at that level of analysis separated by the personality types, but we kind of do have some general, descriptors of movement that I can talk about for a few minutes. So one thing, Jason, that we wanted to do is keeping in mind the purpose of the study was really to illuminate what bucks are doing, during the hunting season. What are hunters seeing, and us really trying to figure out, what's going on. And so we kind of have a different way of looking at this that we thought was interesting, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those. But we wanted to look on a daily scale. So rather than Steve and I saying that, hey, over a 2-month period or 4-month period, this is the number of acres a buck occupied, we looked at everything on a daily scale so that we could really relate that to what is a hunter, what can they expect on if they're hunting 2 days in a row or for a weekend or whatever, to help kind of figure this out a little bit. And when we look at how far a buck is moving, we broke that down into 2 different ways. And so keep in mind the way our data are structured. Is we have this collar that's on a buck, and it's recording a GPS location at these fixed intervals. And so we can parse that up day by day. And we did just that. And we looked at what is the total path length, the path spot by spot where we got a location. What is the total of that for an entire day? And then something we also call displacement, which simply means what's the difference or the distance between where the buck started that day and where it ended up 24 hours later. And so those can be, of course, very, very different. And what was really interesting is when you look at these, is the change that is going to occur, and as you would expect, relative to the rut. So just to give you some idea, again, on this net displacement, which to me, when I started looking at these data, I was like, man, this really makes a lot of sense in that, we typically think this old particular buck, that old 8-pointer, that's where it beds. And every day, or most days, that's where it's going to be bedding. But within a 24-hour period, they are moving all over the landscape. So when you are pre-rut, and for us down here, that's going to be October, November, like that, that net displacement, which again is the difference between where it started and then 24 hours later, where's it at, you're looking at almost 1,000 yards. So on a day-to-day, you've got a difference of about 1,000 yards from where that buck started, and then 24 hours later when it starts again. So a lot different than it coming back to the same spot day after day and bedding. And then relative to the total amount of area traversed by that buck during the day, in the pre-rut, we're looking at about 1,500 yards. So
Wow.
1,500 yards, he's traversing all over the landscape. So yeah, that screams to me is even when you're in the South and you have this 1,000-acre, property or lease, or in some of these places 5,000 acres or greater. I mean, these bucks are traveling off property a great deal of the time, and then both of those values increase a great deal, as you would expect, when you get to the rut. And so when you get to the pre-rut, which we're calling like about 2 weeks before the peak, you start seeing those daily path lengths. They're now at between 1,800 and 2,000 yards. And the displacement, where it started and where it finished, is over 1,000 yards at that time. But when we get to the early rut, right before the peak and the peak rut, you're well over 2,000 yards of that buck, the path length during the day. And now your net displacement is about 1,500 yards. So you start putting that in the context of management, you can see that these bucks are really all over the landscape. And it's not just on a daily scale, where they're all over the landscape in one path. It's day to day to day. They're shifting. They're probably trying to locate different focal groups of does, which does are an estrus, hanging out in that area, tending that particular doe if one's an estrus, and moving around the landscape in that regard. So Jason Travis, I was talking about yards, like the distance of it. Let's look at more of a spatial scale like acres. And again, down here, when we're just in the fall, this is even before we have any rut signals at all. So I wouldn't even designate this the pre-rut. But you're looking at a daily home range, about 140 acres. So from start to finish in that day, when you plot all the little points on the landscape, draw a polygon around it, you're going to cover about 140 acres. And then as we move into the pre-rut and then the early rut, the beginning of it and the peak and so forth, we're going to go from a daily home range of about 140 acres. We're going to move that up to well over 230, about 240 acres a day. So that just kind of gives you some insight versus looking at how much territory they cover over the season or over the year. On a daily scale, that's what's going on. And it really, to me, it answers a lot of questions of whether we're talking actually hunting, whether we're talking about trail cam photos. That buck was here today. It's gone for a week. I got it again. We kind of have a little greater insight as to what's going on there.
And just so I'm clear, that is when you're talking about the 240 acres. That's is that an average, or is that?
That's correct.
It's not the maximum distance. Okay.
Yeah,
and
that's the average. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point to make. Some are a little more, some are a little less, but out of those 50 to 60 bucks, that's the average. Okay.
And that's point A to point B, basically a circuit of 24 hours. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's a good way to express it. A circuit is that total path length of 24 hours.
Right.
Yeah, and one way, everybody has, a lot of people have these step counters watches now.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of how many steps did you take today? And that total path length is like how many steps. And then the displacement is, you started stepping here, and where do you end up stepping at the end of the day, and what's that distance?
Gotcha. Okay.
Guys, did you notice any difference with topography and heavily timbered areas changing and maybe shrinking that average down?
That's a great question. We have not looked at that specific question yet.
I would imagine there's so many.
Keep in mind, too, we don't have, where we're located, too. We have a lot of different in vegetation types, but topography really isn't that big of a deal for us. We're relatively flat land.
Yep.
Yeah. And just to put kind of describe this 60 to 70,000 acre study area. It's a mix of bottomland hardwoods along the Big Black River and ag fields, some managed pine stands, and some old fields that are kind of grassy fields, and some food plots. And there's also some of the landowners have feeders. Feeders are allowed here in Mississippi. This Big Black River is pretty interesting too. It's called the Big Black. It's not like big like Mississippi River big, but it's anywhere from 30 to 100 feet across. And when it's like right now, we've been getting a lot of rain. It's up near flood stage. So it's a pretty formidable river. And about half of our bucks were crossing that thing like it wasn't even there. So they just
Really?
swam across. Yeah.
That's
So what's
surprising.
interesting, Steve, and this is one of those, Jason, we always say on the average. I noticed you brought that up. But then, Steve, we had some bucks that never would cross the river. Yeah. I mean, you got 50,000 locations from that buck over an entire year, and it goes right to the bank. And never, best we can tell, never even steps foot in it. Yeah. There's a lot of differences.
Yeah. In fact, we have almost 1 million location estimates off of these bucks. During the 6 months from September through February, which covered our 4-month hunting season, and then we had a month before and a month after. During those 6 months, they were taking a location estimate every 15 minutes. So we had a very fine scale look at what they were doing. And the rest of the year, it was every 3 or 4 hours.
Interesting.
A lot of locations and a huge sample size of adult bucks.
So when it comes to these bucks, did you see any similarities of their choice of bedding areas?
The short answer is yes. But let me qualify that by saying it's got to be someplace thick. We call it screening cover.
Yep.
I guess that's our little fancy term for it of what we measure, screening cover. But that is the common denominator, and this is going to apply to the Midwest, the South, the East, wherever, is that they are comfortable in terms of where they are bedding, where they have cover. And I don't think that's a great surprise. I do, Steve and I both, when we're working with landowners on what things they can do to their property to attract and hold more bucks. It seems like so many people focus on food plots or supplemental feeding and all this sort of stuff. But largely one of the easiest things you can do to get the greatest return on your investment is creating a lot more cover. And again, it doesn't matter where you're at. The simple way to do that is essentially getting sunlight on the ground and letting Mother Nature take care of the rest. So if you're in a heavily forested area like we are in the Southeast, that typically means either removing some trees, total removal of trees over some unit of area, or just thinning your forest. Just taking about half the trees out is going to result in sunlight striking the ground and plant succession happening. And yeah, we saw it time and time and time again. When we would step into a forest stand, you could literally predict, just looking across the landscape, and point your finger and say, that's where a buck's going to be bedded. And sure enough, that's what the data revealed. That's where they were headed out. That's where they were bedded. And we even noticed, Steve, if you remember, we did some on the ground inspection of some of these bedding areas. And remember, even the paths that they would take out of cover, they would follow paths that gave them cover leading out. So to kind of paint a picture for you, if you were in a forest adjacent to, say, a food plot or an ag field or whatever, and the buck could step out of that cover and could go, left, right, straight ahead, wherever there was a greater amount of screening cover that was leading to the food source, more often than not, that is the path that it took. And I don't know if you remember, Steve, but I thought, it was interesting seeing it, but I was also like, man, if I'm a bow hunter, you can sure take advantage of that.
Absolutely. And if we can, Jason, put a plug in the MSU Deer Lab Facebook page and YouTube channel. We actually have videos where we took camera crew out, and you can look at the areas that had the cover vegetative characteristics of bedding areas, and we also looked at the vegetative characteristics of areas within that daily home range that were never occupied by the deer. We had 15-minute intervals, so we knew where the bucks were, and we also knew where they weren't. But within that home range, places, they don't use their home range homogeneously. It's not all the same. And they're going to focus and spend more time in certain vegetative areas. And the videos on the MSU Deer Lab Facebook page or YouTube channel have that very clearly shown. And we even used a deer mannequin to help show it on camera.
Yeah, I'll definitely
to have a deer's eye view.
I'll definitely put a link to those videos, and I've seen those videos, some of them. I don't know if I've seen all of them, but I've seen some of them. But for right now, we're just going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and talk about where bucks don't bred.
UC Hunting Properties is a platform built for delivering knowledge gained from a lifetime spent on the land and water. An elite group of land experts spread across the nation, built to succeed, built to be the best. This new united brand is designed to raise the bar in the recreational and hunting world of real estate. UC Hunting Properties land specialists are dedicated to obtaining local knowledge in order to ensure relationships with their clients continuing beyond the transaction. For this team, it's more than selling land. It's a way of life. It's a passion, a freedom. It's uniting buyers and sellers through world-class national marketing efforts specific to recreational land and a highly functional and SEO-designed website with unmatched excellence in service before, during, and after the transaction. At UC Hunting Properties, we put boots on the ground, walking acre after acre. UC Hunting Properties is moving forward. Are you?
All right, we're back. I said before we went on break there that we'd talk about where bucks don't bred. I meant bed. Where don't bucks bed?
Well, real general here, it's where they can be seen and obviously seen. That the habitat type or vegetation type will vary where you're at, but in the context of the Southeast, it's essentially in these areas where you have a closed canopy forest. So just imagine a place where you would like to sit and hunt, whether you're in a climbing stand or a ladder stand or whatever, but you get up there 15, 20 feet off the ground and you can see for a couple hundred yards around you. That's a great place to intercept a buck if it were to be moving through that stand, chasing a doe or whatever, but it's not a place where a buck is going to bed. And so really it's these places where there is sufficient cover. It could be grassy cover. It could be brush. It could be a young forest, just whatever. But essentially it's a place, I think, Steve, we joke about it. If it's something you don't want to walk through, then it's probably a place a buck's gonna bed.
Yeah, we actually, when we were filming these bedding sites, it was hard to get into them because of the briars.
Interesting. Well, your mind just goes, as a hunter, your mind goes in 100 different directions because you'd like to, micro analyze this in the very micro sense. And in many ways, I'm sure you guys have to keep it in a macro. Otherwise, you'll never conclude the study. And maybe you never will, but wow, there's a lot of different moving parts. Do you guys think that there is going to be a difference in the deer's overall movement based on the part of the country that it's in, or would you think that on the average they're going to do about the same thing?
I'll start. I think they're going to do about the same thing. I think the tree species are going to be different. The grass species are going to be different, but relative to things like food, cover, structure of the cover, I think it's going to be pretty uniform.
Yeah. And, you're probably aware of northern deer populations during the winter. They oftentimes migrate to bedding areas, or wintering, what's the word?
Yards.
Deer yards, yeah, which are typically coniferous stands with a dense cover that protects them from heat loss during the night and also minimizes the snowpack or snow depth underneath those conifers. And that idea that the northern deer move back and forth, I think that partly explains our migratory movements of these mobile bucks or the roamers, is I think it's in their DNA, Jason, and to just go places and know what's in different areas. And I think these migratory movements between two home ranges is in part of the DNA that ties them back very similarly to the movements that northern deer have to make to survive the winter. The deer down here don't have to do it, but a portion of them still do it.
So they kind of have may I paraphrase, Steve, or try? Genetically, they have the capacity to do that. And in some places they have to, and in other places they choose to.
Yeah, exactly. So the short answer to your question is yes, the deer are going to behave similarly. And that's why we categorize these time periods in rut, peak rut, early rut, post rut, because if we said, well, between December 25 and January 7th is peak rut, well, that has no meaning to you because or any of your listeners, they might have a breeding peak in October or November or December. So we don't want to talk about specific days, but the behaviors are the same.
Right. That was one of the things that I wanted to ask, and you basically answered it. If you saw any similarities year after year in terms of when these bucks started to roam, I'm sure you did because we addressed that earlier. But as a rule, on the average, did they start to rut, if you will, on a particular date? And I know it's different for every part of the country, but I think you said in your part of the world, part of the rut starts depending upon what part of the state you're in late October, early November. Is that correct?
Not that early, no. Let me generalize a little bit.
Okay.
Every deer population, every white-tailed deer population has the majority of their breeding taking place within their adult does. They're bred within a 45-day period, roughly. Okay. And when that 45-day period takes place will vary by, from north to south, but even within states like Mississippi, we have a huge variation in when that peak breeding takes place. But 45 days, it's going to be pretty consistent north to south across the United States and even into Canada. But when that peak rut will vary. But within that 45-day period, think about it basically as a 6-week interval. There's 2 weeks right in the smack dab middle of it, that is the peak of the rut. And 70% of the does are going to be bred during that 2-week interval. That's when things are really hot, a lot of buck movements taking place. 2 weeks before that is early rut. There's some breeding taking place, but most of the does haven't really come in yet. And then after the peak of the rut, there's still some does being bred. But again, it's only about 15% during that last 2-week period. So it's a 6-week period, but I can promise your listeners and you all that those 6 weeks are roughly the same behavioral changes regardless of where you are in the United States.
I think it's a good argument for people to have 6 weeks off a year.
Easy.
Hey, second.
One of the questions, unless Trav, you had anything right at this moment, one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, within that 45 days, if you subscribe to the theory that there's a seeking and chasing phase, and then there's the quote unquote lockdown, did you see? It would seem to me that from a cursory glance that if there was a seeking and chasing phase, you'd see a whole bunch of, you'd see that circuit extend to, maybe the 240 plus acres. And then during another phase of the rut, you would see that shrink down. Did you see any of that, or haven't you looked at it that closely?
I'll take a stab at that. And not exactly as the way you described it, but the way we looked at that is, again, think of the data that we have. We have these, and during the hunting season, that time of year, we've got locations every 15 minutes. Well, people that are a lot smarter than me, and really a lot. No,
I was looking for a way to cut it and say, and a whole lot more smarter than me.
But they're able to take this data, and so looking at the location and the direction, meaning where the next location is, and the amount of ground that was covered in between those two locations, they can come up with a velocity. But based on that, you can kind of come up with these behavioral categories. Mm-hmm. And so we developed 3 behavioral categories where, again, just characterizing the patterns of the locations, we can pretty much determine, was the buck walking, was the buck bedded, or was the buck feeding or tending. And so you can see it's really kind of difficult to disentangle tending or feeding, but it's kind of a similar behavior, meaning that they're moving around, but it's not with the purpose, I guess you could say, like you are walking, trying to get from point A to point B in the shortest amount of time. And so what we see, so we looked at that, of course, on a daily scale, and then on our seasonal scale relative to the rut. And so as you might imagine, that when we look at the bedded behavior, that is occurring overwhelmingly most during the day. So during the daytime, that is when they are bedded the most. And then again, when they are bedded the least amount of time is going to be at dawn and dusk, which again is those are the times of day where we see the greatest walking behavior. So they are moving greater distances, as every hunter knows, a couple hours around dawn, a couple hours around dusk, and they are moving less and bedded more during the middle of the day. And then at nighttime, it's kind of in between. So they are not bedded as often as you see during the middle of the day, during the middle of the night, but they are certainly not moving as much as they do during nighttime as you see during dawn and dusk. Okay. So, and that was something, I know that has some intuitive appeal, it makes sense, but relative to what you hear people say all the time, Steve, it's the rut and they're running all night. Our data just don't support that they're moving all night. They are still moving sun up, sundown. That is the most often time that they are demonstrating this walking behavior.
Interesting.
Now, when we go from characterizing that by daily scale, and then we start moving at the season, again, it's kind of some intuitive results. So let's take the walking behavior. They are walking less. And if you want me to give you some numbers here, if you wanted to partition the amount of time that they're in the walking behavior, the amount of time they're in the feeding or tending, and the amount of time that they're bedded, we're looking at about 10% of the time they demonstrate a walking behavior.
During what?
During the pre-rut. During the pre-rut, 10% of the time. It's about 35% of the time they are spent in the feeding and tending behavior during the pre-rut, and right at just shy of 50%. That's something to keep in mind here, that in the pre-rut, about 50% of the time, their behavior is they're bedded. Now, let me contrast that with the peak of the rut. During the peak of the rut, that bedding time goes down from 50% down to 40%. And the walking goes from about 10% to 25%. So they are moving, again, as we know, if you hunt, you're seeing deer move around a lot more during the rut. And behavior-wise, that's exactly, what we saw. Interestingly, the behavior that doesn't change that much in terms of the percentage of time during the day and season by season is the feeding and tending behavior. That is kind of uniform. It's about 35% of a buck's time that they're demonstrating that behavior. So I hope that addressed your question, Jason, in terms of how we're kind of looking at their behavior on a daily scale and seasonal scale.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
And one of the cool little parts I see in the data is, that really consistent feeding and tending. And we're calling it feeding and tending because we can't differentiate those two. But in the pre-rut, it's feeding. It's not tending because there's no does being bred. During the peak of the rut, it's probably, 50-50. But then if you look at the post-rut, well after the rut, and the guys, the males, the adult males in your listening audience, like identify with this. After you've been romantic with your significant other, you either fall asleep or you get up and get something to eat. and there's a slight uptake in the feeding behavior after the rut, and that's when if you go out to places with like food plots. I talked to one of our cooperative landowners today, and he said, and this is after the rut now, and he said, yeah, we're seeing the bucks showing up in the food plots during the day. It's because they're out there eating now.
Well, they lost 20%, sometimes it's greater, sometimes it's less. But that's what we see with Mississippi deer. 15, 20, sometimes 25% of their body weight was lost from pre-rut, early fall pre-rut till the end of hunting season. So they have to recover. Yeah.
And they're losing
and a lot of times,
10% of
I like
sleep.
to think of it as they wake up and kind of like, whoa, where have I been for the last 3 months? I'm hungry.
Right.
Hey, so let me describe the data. And that was Steve Demarais that made that comment earlier. That was not Bronson Strickland. Just in case
about somebody complained about going to the refrigerator after sex.
Just covering my bases there.
It happens.
So let's look at this walking behavior during the post-rut. The walking behavior is only about 8% of the behavior they demonstrate in the post-rut. So you've got about 92% of their time they are either bedded or feeding. So walking very, very little. Versus, remember, keep that number in mind, compare that to 25% of their time was walking during the peak of the rut.
And that's why it's good to hunt during the peak of the rut. 25% of their time is spent walking. They have a greater chance of stumbling into you where you are hunting.
So when you talk about, the behavior of walking dropping down after the peak of the rut, that would kind of coincide with people talking about the lockdown, and they're not on their feet as much because they're either feeding or sleeping at this point, not necessarily locked down with does. They're just recouping.
Yeah, yeah. At that point, they have two things on their mind: rest and recovery, and feeding. Yeah.
So, just like everyone likes to talk about the October lull, in our world, you could say there's, and I'm stealing Clint's terminology again here. You could say that there's a December lull, really. Because if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is there's going to be a point in time where they become relatively sedentary and shrink that range per day, if you will, that circuit that they're running per day is going to shrink up quite a bit because they're conserving energy, putting on pounds, and getting themselves ready for the winter. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I think you could generalize like that, and I think Jason, you and I have talked about the lull topic before, and
yep.
Yeah, but if we go back to that daily home range, back to those data, yeah, we really don't see. In other words, the lull that is occurring in our neck of the woods is totally before there's any rut activity. They are just occupying a much, much smaller area. And again, that number was about 140 acres on a daily scale. And then we see that just step up when we go from the pre-rut and the early rut, and then we hit rut peak, and then the later part of the rut, and then it just steps down. So we peak there at the peak of the rut in terms of the daily amount of area that they're navigating.
Okay. Any well, let me just back up and say that during the hunting season was one of the things we talked about, Travis. What kind of change? So you guys were able to monitor the deer while they were being hunted. What if any any kind of change did you see in behavior at that point?
And one thing I want to add.
Thanks for bringing us back to.
Yeah, the hunting
main
pressure.
reason we did this study was to look at how hunting activity affected the deer. There's so much, when you're a deer nut like me and Bronson, and we have all this data, there's so many different ways to look at it, Travis and Jason. We can chase rabbits.
We get sidetracked.
Yeah, all these things we've been talking about are really, really cool, and they're exciting. But the big question we were asked to answer was, how did hunting and basically level of risk affect deer behavior? And so we did look at that, and there's a lot of variation across our 4 months of hunting season, and part of that hunting season involves the rut, so it's hard to tease those out. But we looked at different habitat types and whether or not they were preferred or preferred or selected for, where bucks would use them or not. And on days when there was little hunting risk and days there was a kind of a moderate hunting risk, and then there were days when there was a heavier hunting risk. So kind of think of it as, not much going on, a lot of hunters in the woods, but then a whole lot of hunters in the woods. And,
sure.
Back in my New England days, I might see 20 or 30 hunters in a day walking. Either I walk by them or they walk by me. That's a lot of hunting pressure in one patch of woods where I was hunting.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real high risk day for the deer that are in those woods. We found that whatever habitats our bucks were selecting for or using on the low and moderate hunting risk days, they actually, when you get up in the upper third, the higher risk days, they started avoiding their previously preferred or selected for habitat. So we think of it as a tipping point. And when you get into that one upper third of heavier risk activity, heavier hunting activity, folks are going to start avoiding the habitats that they had been using. So if you've got it figured out where deer are going to be and you pile in there to look for them, they're not going to be there anymore.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, we look at, in the real estate world of things, not everybody can afford land, and, what people do is they divide land and take, 120 acres and divide it up 3 different ways. So, you got 3 smaller parcels. And, that increases to the hunting pressure. But even if those smaller 40, 50 acre parcels are hunted, accessed correctly, and are in a high dense deer area, people can still manage smaller parcels with just hunting pressure and making the necessary environmental choices for putting different habitat in for their whitetail and other species. Would you guys agree with that versus owning thousands of acres?
I agree 100%. I agree 100%, Travis. And, that daily home range is going to be larger, at least it was in our study, than a 40-acre parcel. But that 40 acres, if it's managed so that there's cover and food and does and some cover connecting the bedding area and the feeding area, you're going to have deer being in there a lot of the time.
So would it be...
The key is have that environment, Travis, like that terminology. I like that, the right environmental conditions, and then not hunting it too heavily.
Mm-hmm. And hunting it right. I mean, hunting with the right wind. And I mean, because we always hear at, hunting camp stories, the neighbor that owns 600 acres next to us controls all the deer. Well, that neighbor is hunting the wind correctly, only hunting when the, conditions are right for what they think is a, day to, see deer and see them on their feet and, being monitored. And, and that's being developed more with these cell cameras now, with lowering the hunting pressure on these smaller parcels also. But you just don't need that huge chunk of ground to control it. You just got to control your anxiousness to be in the woods. And, that's hard to do. Like you said, we're all deer nuts, and staying out of the woods is, I mean, I could come up with 100 different examples of what it's related to, but it's hard to do.
It's not in our DNA.
Yeah. And I used the term earlier, lazy hunters. One of our problems here in the South is hunters don't want to walk to their stands. They want to drive their four-wheelers to within 100 yards of their stand and then maybe walk 100 yards. And then they hunt the same stands day after day, and they get upset because they're not seeing the deer. And I have a problem, well, I don't have a problem. I mean, everybody has the right to do how they want to hunt. But as an educator and a wildlife biologist and a deer nut, I want to tell them what I'm, that's not smart.
Yeah. The deer have patterned them. Yeah. The deer have patterned the hunter. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty easy math to do. Wow. So how many years has this study taken place? Was it 7?
No, it was a 3-year study. We collared the deer one winter and then followed them through the next 2 winters of hunting seasons.
Okay.
And then we're now in the data analysis stage.
You bring up that you collared them in the winter. That was after the hunting season, I would assume. And earlier in the show, you talked about most over 90% of the deer that were collared were not collared but tranquilized during the evening, so you had to get within bow range and things like that. If you would have collared them in the summer or before they went through hunting pressure, do you think that would have changed when you would have been able to tranquilize them?
Well, actually, yeah. We started, the first capture was during the winter, and then deer died. Mm-hmm. And we had some hit by cars. We had some die from hemorrhagic disease. We had some collars just fall off. So we caught them that first winter, and then we had to replace collars the following summer. And then the next winter after the hunting season, we had to put more collars back on. And so we caught deer in the winter and summer, early fall, over the roughly 2 years. And there was no variation in when the deer were active. It was almost always at night.
You guys didn't have any EHD issues during this with any of your herd that was collared at all, did you?
Yeah. The first year we had I want to say a 12% mortality rate that we presumed was all EHD, hemorrhagic disease.
And with that, what is it, 24, 48 hours from when they get infected or that they die, or how long before? I mean, could you almost trace the area where it happened?
We might be able to do that, but we haven't tried to look at that. We're still looking at these big pictures. That's some really interesting disease epidemiology stuff that could be done in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, you could actually kind of narrow it down to kind of the habitat that species grows in. And, I know there's, chemicals out there that people are spraying to eliminate those diseases happening anymore and things like that. But, it's all interesting, stuff, but there's no so much time in the day and so many days we need to be in a tree stand. So,
guys,
another source of mortality that we had was pedicle injuries and brain infection, bacterial infections in the brain abscesses.
Oh, okay.
I think we lost about 5% of our bucks to that each year.
Interesting. Yeah, I've got a few bucks that just pop into my head that I haven't seen now. On the place where I hunt, I've only been there 2 years, but I know that the one buck has been there for a number of years, even prior to me getting there, just because of all the sheds that they've got. He just kind of up and disappeared, and I would love to find out where he went. But I've also now seen 2 years in a row deer that just vacated the premises on or around October, both years now, right around October 20th to 24th, I would say. 2 years in a row that's happened. So I think the FBI would call that a clue that they're probably going to do it again next year if they're alive.
And Clint would call him a roamer.
Right, exactly. Well, hey, we've taken an hour at least of your time. I want to just finish up, if it's okay with you guys, with just a couple quick questions for each of you. And they're both going to be the same question for each of you, and that is, I'll start with you, Bronson. What's the biggest myth you feel like you guys have debunked so far?
I would say bucks shifting into the total nocturnal behavior. We're definitely seeing some differences in how bucks are going to navigate the landscape. That's kind of the last topic we talked about, changing, maybe habitat type, and we talked about how they can be overhunted. But we're just not seeing this broad scale, whether it be because of hunting pressure or whether it be because of the rut, etc. We're just not seeing this. The bucks have gone nocturnal. There's no point in hunting them. We don't see them. Rather what we found that the alternative or the explanation is that they're just in a different area. You know, rather than being on your 50 or 2 or 300 acre area, is that there may be 3 or 4 consecutive days where he's off your property, but more than likely he's going to be back. So, to me, I think that's been the biggest misconception.
How about you, Steve?
Well, I think it's we've shown clearly that the deer population hasn't become devastated from hunting. The state wildlife agency has not overprescribed the bag limit. Hunters just need to listen to great podcasts like yours and learn about our great research and become smarter, informed hunters that make the effort to find where the bucks are and not overpressure them, and they'll be more successful.
Steve? I'll go right back to you. What's the biggest aha moment you had?
The aha was the personality stuff. I had seen some anecdotal examples from past research where I've been involved as well in, where we just had, maybe 10 bucks collared, and we'd have one that would be, like making these weird back and forth movements. And now we had a much larger sample size. We were able to really capture that population level. A third of these bucks are living in 2 places, and that's just like, wow, that is so cool.
Yeah, definitely. Bronson, your aha moment?
Well, I agree with Steve. I think that was the biggest and most novel aha was the personality. I guess secondary, what I really like is the way we looked at this daily scale, the amount of area they use in a day, and that displacement that we talked about, where they started the circuit and where they ended the circuit, for that day. I just thought that was it explained so much to where hunters and hey, including me for a long time, just have the thought of, there's this central place, there's this bedroom that this buck's going to go back to every day, and all of his movements are going to radiate out on a daily scale, from that point, and then he'll return. And but instead, it's a patchwork. It's a daily circuit here, and you might have to shift 1,000 yards over, and there's a daily circuit over there, and then there's a shift the next day, and it just really folds into some of our previous analyses and some of our colleagues in Texas that were finding these what we call these focal groups. Mm-hmm. And it just coincides very well with there's this patchwork of little doe family groups on the landscape. And a buck is just probably moving from, place to place, spending a day or two, and then back a day or two, and another place a day or two, and just checking on the condition of those females. So other than the personality, to me, that was probably the most noteworthy and illuminating in understanding deer biology and helping me as a hunter.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Guys, I got a question, and I don't know if you was part of your study or if you have an opinion on it, but it's kind of the great debate that different generations of hunters debate on every year.
Oh boy.
And that's the harvesting of does, and some think that getting harvesting a number of does helps out for a more aggressive rut, and letting all the does go and never harvesting any does is great for just the population in general. Was any of that part of your study in areas that were maybe not overshooting, but more heavily managed on shooting of does in their management plan?
Great question, Travis. We had hoped to do that. We had an idea that some of the properties were not shooting as many does as some of the other properties, but when we actually looked at their harvest data, they were all pretty well managing the same way. This is a 60,000, 70,000 acre area that the state wildlife biologists had been working with closely for 20 or 30 years to get them all rowing in the same direction. So that's why there's so many adult bucks in this area. The properties have been well managed, and they've been shooting their does. They've been doing some food plots and some limited habitat management. So there wasn't anything broken with this system that we could look between this and that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that is the great debate, though, and it's inside our family it is, and inside a lot of families, and it's just kind of fun to get people's opinion and things like that on it, because it.
Yeah, and I might ramble a little bit more with you, Travis, on that. There's a biologist, mutual biologist friend of ours down here likes to say there's no such thing as cookie cutter deer management. And I agree with that statement 100%. There are general principles that are consistent, but each management situation has to be evaluated based on the acreage, the habitat characteristics, what's the population like, what are the neighbors, neighboring properties doing, what are they not doing, and every deer population needs to be managed. It needs to be taken care of, and how closely you take care of it depends upon your management goals and objectives and how much you want to work. Because a lot of landowners and hunters love to sit on a stand and shoot a deer when they feel like shooting a deer, but they don't want to do the work of deer management. And that's one of the biggest frustrations I think we've had working with properties and landowners is getting them to do the work consistently, year in, year out. You can start somebody on a new management program, and 1, 2, 3 years into it, they're doing, they start out really excited, enthusiastic, and after about third year of shooting their quota of does, it's like, that's not fun anymore. After the first one of the season, it's like, oh, I don't want to shoot another one.
It becomes work.
It just takes, and a lot of people don't understand that. They just want to do all the fun stuff.
Yeah, and it comes to carrying capacity too. I was on a farm here a couple weeks ago that had a pretty aggressive harvest done, and had some oak regeneration that was about a foot tall. And I said, when was that harvested? Well, it was harvested 15 years ago. And those oaks will never get to grow with the amount of deer that are on. They just keep eating the tops, and they just are stunted. And that's a lot. You got to look at your habitat too, with having too many animals on your farm or property, that you don't they call mining the soil, the farmers, but you're kind of mining the habitat with too many does also.
Yeah,
good way to think about it.
What's that? Oh,
that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, you're right. I guess I hadn't thought about it like that. That is a good way to think about it. Any final thoughts from you guys?
I guess I never really finished the thought I started rambling on a little while ago about the whole variation and all. There's no set harvest recommendations across the board, but a biologist or someone trained properly that really understands what the habitat is, what it could be, what it should be, and what the deer population is or isn't on your property needs to make those recommendations, whether or not does need to be harvested and at what rate.
So would it be fair to say, and I'm not trying to start a controversy with the Wisconsin DNR, that it's not static across the state. It's not one size fits all, and not that they've made it one size fits all. But how would you recommend, guys, getting a good grip on how many deer are on your property, and then is there a resource that you would recommend once you do like a trail camera study based on in Bronson, we've talked about a trail camera study. If you go back into the archives in some of our podcasts, we talked about doing a trail camera study and how to do a trail camera study. Is there a good resource that you guys would recommend for getting an idea of how many does you should harvest?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to say. Excuse me. Let me start by this. You need to know where you're at. And so, you want to end up with a number, a harvest number. So you need to have some reliable indicator of how many deer you have on any given day. And Jason, just as you recommended, I think that the best way to do that for most people would be a trail camera survey. And if you go to our website, msudeerlab.com, we've got a module there. There's a publication you can download, has a worksheet, and tells you how to do all that. The other side of that is deer condition can tell you if you are carrying too many deer or not. And what I mean by that is the amount of fat that is on their body by the end of hunting season. Pretty reliable indicator that the ratio of the number of deer relative to the amount of food that is on your property is skewed. And so, of course, I've been on properties where it's December or January down here, and man, you pull the skin off and there's just handfuls and handfuls of fat. What's the doe harvest recommendation for them? I'm probably going to say whatever you've been doing. And even if you're at a place to where you want to see a few more deer, you might want to back off of your doe harvest. But more than likely in that case, it's just if you're harvesting 10 does a year, 30, 50, whatever it is, keep doing what you're doing because deer condition is fantastic. But if you're in a situation where deer condition, and again, I'm not talking about during bow season early in the year, I'm talking about the end of deer season.
Right.
If those deer have very little fat on their body, you need to start thinking about reducing population size a little bit more. And then the magic number of how many you need to is going to be based on how many have you been harvesting in the past. And I would just incrementally increase that number until you start seeing deer condition improve.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Mm-hmm. Well, guys,
that was great.
We're going to approach an hour and a half here, and I'm sure you guys have other stuff to do. But I just want to say thanks again for taking time out of your day to spend with us and educate our listeners. We probably haven't scratched the surface on all the other things that you're going on, so we'll circle back around eventually here and find out what's going on. But in the meantime, if people want to get a more in-depth look at what it is that you're doing, I think a great resource is your Facebook page. I'll put a link to that in the show description, in the show notes, and then also to the Mississippi State University's Deer Lab webpage. I'll put a link there as well. Any other resources that you guys want to recommend where people could check out what it is that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. One last thing is the kind of stuff that we're doing and talking about on your podcast, Jason, is that's kind of the basis for all of the material we talk about on the MSU Deer Lab podcast, which is called Deer University. And so if you just search iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, search for Deer University, you'll find episodes that address these types of topics. And so all Steve and I do, it might be Steve interviewing someone, me interviewing someone, or Steve and I talking together or with other biologists. And we just have topics that are about deer biology and management that we think are of interest to hunters and to help them understand deer a little bit better and understand deer management a little bit better and have applications to hunt smarter. So I would wrap it up by saying check out our Deer University podcast.
Awesome. I'll put a link to that in the show as well. Thanks a bunch, guys. Stay warm. Sorry you're dealing with a little bit of weather. We're all hunkering down
We're waiting for it.
For the evening here. Trav's got the snowplow hanging off the front of the truck. We're supposed to get, 12 inches or maybe 2 We'll see. We'll see what happens. It's not going to be fun either way. But until we talk again, thanks so much. Again, just look at the show notes for the resources to look up what these folks are doing. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talking with y'all.
Likewise. Have a good rest of your day. Well, there you have it. Another episode of the White Knuckle Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show and hope you picked up a few nuggets of information along the way that you can use down the road. I want to take just a second and thank our partner in this endeavor, and that is UC Hunting Properties. Without them, this couldn't be possible. You guys all know that I work with UC Hunting Properties, and they're actually nationwide. I would encourage you, for any of your property needs, go to www.uchuntingproperties.com. Thanks for listening. Jason out.